Buenas noches y bienvenidos a mi canal. I'm going to be doing most of today's video in English because it's for a class project. And the idea is that my professor understands. But yeah, normally I would be teaching mostly in the target language. But yeah, that being said, given that it's in English, yeah, we're going to be going over some tips and tricks for how to form words in Spanish based on pattern recognition, basically. Because there are a number of patterns that actually allow you to guess, like, quite a few words, just going from English to Spanish. For example, probably the most, or like the best example is the fact that any word that ends in AL in English is generally speaking just the same in Spanish. For example, personal, natural, animal. You just have, excuse me, you just have to pronounce them all with a Spanish accent. So, personal, natural, animal. It's important to note that the vowels are very different. I think that's the biggest distinction, where A is like car, but kind of more like an Australian. So, ka. My Australian accent isn't great. E is like pet, also a little better if it's like Australian. So, pet. Yeah, I is like eat, also kind of better in Australian, but like e. O is like goat, but without like the W at the end. So when you say goat in English, it's kind of like goat. Whereas, yeah, the Spanish O is just O. So goat, would be got. And then U is also kind of, yeah, it's like goose, and it's also kind of cut off. So ooh. But yeah, that being said, moving on to the next trick. And that's just important to apply to all of these tricks because, yeah, the accent is important. The phonetics make it what it is. Although it's not like it's not the biggest deal in the world. People will understand you. But yeah, that being said, another helpful trick is that words that end in IC usually end in ICO in Spanish. So, for example, basic, básico, public, público, artistic, artístico. Furthermore, multisyllabic verbs that end in ate in English just replace ate with ar, and you have the infinitive of the verb. It's important to note that you still have to conjugate them. But yeah, that being said, yeah, important to note that it has to be multisyllabic. So like great or crate don't work. You still have to apply Spanish phonetics. But for example, yeah, illuminate, yeah, would just be iluminar. Yeah, iluminar. Imaginate would be imaginar. Pretty sure that's an English word. Yeah, and then, yeah, again, important to remember that it still requires conjugation. Also important to note that, like, for a word like overcompensate, like the word compensate is just compensar, but over you can't just put into Spanish. So that would be sobre. So overcompensate would become sobrecompensar. Yeah, and sometimes these aren't one-to-one definitions. So for example, create, you can say crear, but it's a little more common to say hacer. But it just depends on the context and the dialect and a lot of factors. Yeah, and then terminate, terminar, yeah, means like to come to an end. Yeah, to fire or to kill, which is how we use terminate sometimes in English, don't work great, but the definition's similar. But yeah, in a similar vein, also, words that end in ation in English and in acción in Spanish. So yeah, all of the same caveats from before still apply, but for example, illumination would be iluminación, overcompensation would be sobrecompensación, creation, creación, termination, terminación. And they're very similar. In a similar vein, ism words usually are the same but end in ismo, and also like words ending in ist end in ista. So for example, communism is comunismo, communist is comunista. Racism would be racismo, racist, racista. And it's important to note that these are general rules. For example, like, never mind. So the next tip is words that end in ity or ity usually end in idad in Spanish. So for example, biodiversity, university, activity become biodiversidad, universidad, y actividad. City, the word city is a notable exception because it's very common. City is ciudad, which is very similar, but they add a little E in there. Or, excuse me, a U. Furthermore, words ending in IOUS often end in ioso in Spanish, so IOSO. So for example, delicious, I feel like this is a very well-known one, at least in the United States, but delicious becomes delicioso. Curious becomes curioso. Anxious becomes ansioso. And pious is kind of an interesting one. It becomes pioso, which just like, I don't know. I think that's silly just because there's one letter that stays constant, but yeah. Another really interesting one that actually will help you spot Spanish speakers in the wild, potentially, is that words that start with an S immediately followed by a consonant in English sometimes will stay pretty similar in Spanish, with an E added at the beginning before the S plus the consonant. So for example, if you hear like native Spanish speakers speaking in English, and they say a word like speak, for example, they'll do this little epenthesis, it's called, where they'll say an E beforehand, so like speak. And other examples are, so stress becomes estrés in Spanish, and that's like an actual word, to be clear. Special becomes especial, and spirit becomes espíritu. School is an interesting case where it's just escuela. And another really interesting one is studious, where, so we have the IOUS thing again. So what we do is we combine the two rules and we get estudioso. Another one, words ending in ible or able sometimes stay the same. So for example, possible and incredible become posible y increíble. And stable, using that same rule from before, becomes estable. Adjectives, next one. Adjectives ending in iv usually end in evil in Spanish. So for example, active, creative, massive become activo, activo, creativo, y masivo. And finally, abstract nouns ending in y usually end in ia in Spanish. So for example, economy, democracy, and fantasy become economía, democracia, y fantasía. But yeah, these are the main tips. Using this, you already have a vocabulary of thousands of words, especially once you work on your Spanish phonetics and your conjugations. So yeah, hopefully this is a helpful start. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Que pasen una buena noche y odio este proyecto.